It was a regular Saturday afternoon at the golf club. The sun hung high in the clear blue sky, casting long shadows on the well-maintained green. The air was calm, save for the occasional sound of a putter meeting a ball. Members milled about, chatting lightly, sipping drinks under the shade of the grand oak trees that dotted the landscape. Nothing unusual seemed to be happening. Then I saw him, an elderly man, probably in his late 70s, walking slowly across the green. He had a dignified presence about him. His posture was upright, but his step was a bit more deliberate than the younger players around him. He was dressed in a light blue polo and beige khakis, a golf glove on his left hand. He moved like he belonged there, his every movement steady and controlled. But it wasn't long before someone else took notice. I didn't see the officer approach, but I could tell something was off when the elderly man suddenly stopped mid-swing. The officer, a young guy in his early 30s, had stepped up to him, his face tight with authority. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside," the officer said, his tone clipped. The elderly man blinked, his calm expression not changing. "Is there a problem, officer? We've had some complaints about you disturbing the play. I'm going to need you to wait here while I sort this out," the officer insisted. The scene, which moments ago was tranquil, now had a tense edge. People began to watch, murmurs filling the air. "Disturbing the play? I've been a member here longer than you've been alive, young man," the elderly man replied, his voice still steady, but now laced with the slightest edge of annoyance. "Doesn't matter. You're causing a disruption, and I need you to comply," the officer responded, his tone firm as he stepped closer, hand on his radio. The elderly man gave a brief, knowing smile. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" The officer didn't seem to hear the words, his eyes narrowing as he reached for his radio. The moment the elderly man spoke, though, a strange calm seemed to wash over him. The man's composure was unsettling in a way that made the officer pause. The elderly man's eyes met his with a quiet intensity, a subtle power behind them that made me feel something was about to shift. The officer hesitated for a split second, his hand still hovering near the radio. He looked the elderly man over once more, as if trying to decide whether he had just made a simple mistake or if something deeper was at play. "You're not going to get away with this," the officer muttered, more to himself than to the man. He straightened his uniform and adjusted his sunglasses, his earlier tension mounting. But there was something different about the elderly man, he wasn't reacting the way anyone else would. Before the officer could speak again, a few of the members gathered around, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. One of them, a man in a crisp suit, stepped forward. He was tall and well-built, his posture just as dignified as the elderly man's. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "perhaps we can sort this out in the club office. I don't think this is the best place for, whatever this is." The officer turned his attention to the man, clearly thrown off by his interruption. "This man is causing a disturbance," the officer said firmly, glancing back at the elderly gentleman. The man in the suit, however, simply raised an eyebrow, glancing from the officer to the elderly man, then back again. "Are you sure about that, officer? I'd hate to think we've been misinformed. After all, this is our club, and we pride ourselves on treating everyone with respect." The officer's eyes flickered, and I could see the slight shift in his demeanor. He had made an assumption about who this man was, but now doubt had crept in. The elderly man, with his relaxed but unshakable confidence, stood silently, letting the tension in the air build. Then came the twist that no one saw coming. The man in the suit made a brief nod toward one of the other members, an older woman who had been quietly observing from a distance. She stepped forward, her heels clicking decisively on the concrete path. With one hand, she pulled her phone from her bag and dialed quickly. "Just a moment," she said softly, as if talking to someone on the other end of the line. The officer didn't seem to notice, too absorbed in his standoff with the elderly man. "Hello," the woman began, her voice cool and composed. "Yes, this is Grace Harrington. I'm at the club, and there's an officer here questioning a member." Can you please have a word with him? Yes, I'll hold. As the officer's face started to turn red from the mounting tension, I realized this wasn't just any member, and this wasn't just any club. Something much bigger was at play here. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity as the officer stood there, clearly agitated, yet unable to move or act decisively. His eyes darted between the elderly man, Grace, and the growing circle of members who had gathered to witness the spectacle. The tension in the air was palpable, and it was obvious that the situation had shifted beyond his control. The phone call on the other end of the line seemed to take forever, but when Grace finally spoke again, her voice was unwavering, laced with an undeniable authority. Yes, I understand. I'll make sure to inform him, she said, hanging up and tucking her phone back into her bag. Then, with a smooth and measured step, she turned to the officer. Officer, I suggest you step aside and reconsider your actions, Grace said. There was no anger in her voice, only a calm assurance. The man you've detained is Mr. James Harrington, founder and owner of this club. He doesn't answer to anyone here but himself. The officer blinked, his face slowly losing its color. His hand dropped from the radio, and his posture shifted from defensive to uncertain. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. James Harrington, the elderly man, remained as composed as ever. He simply nodded toward Grace, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. Thank you, Grace, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience and quiet power. You've done enough. The officer stood frozen, his gaze flickering between the man in front of him and the other members, who were now watching with a mixture of disbelief and mild amusement. No one had expected this twist, least of all the officer, who had been so certain of his authority in that moment. Grace turned to the officer, her gaze now sharp, no longer filled with the warmth she had shown before. I suggest you leave, she said, her voice cutting through the air. Before this gets more complicated for you. For a long moment, the officer didn't move. Then, in a flurry of motion, he grabbed his radio and muttered something under his breath. He turned on his heel and walked away, his face flushed with a mixture of humiliation and confusion. The members began to disperse, their whispers now quiet but filled with awe. It was clear that they had witnessed something rare, a moment when power and respect were not just about authority, but about who truly ran the show. James Harrington didn't have to say another word. The entire club knew exactly who was in charge. As the officer retreated, the tension in the air began to dissolve, but a lingering unease hung around, like the calm after a storm. The members, now back to their casual chatter, were still casting sideways glances toward James Harrington. There was a mix of reverence and curiosity in the way they looked at him, as if they were suddenly seeing him in a new light. Grace, still standing beside the elderly man, smiled faintly. Well, that was more excitement than I expected on a Saturday afternoon. James chuckled softly, the sound warm and reassuring. It's not the first time I've had to remind people who's running things around here. But I suppose it's been a while since anyone forgot. His words were simple, but there was an underlying weight to them, as if he had been holding on to his position for far longer than anyone realized. A position that, at first glance, seemed unassuming, a quiet, elderly man on a golf course. But now, it was clear to everyone that his influence stretched far beyond the greens. The members, once nervous and unsure, began to slowly gather around, offering polite nods and tentative smiles. There were a few murmurs of admiration, and some even began to apologize to James, offering their support. The whole scene had shifted from one of confrontation to an unexpected moment of camaraderie. One member, a younger man who had been playing nearby, stepped forward. I didn't know, sir, he said, a sheepish look on his face. I'm sorry about the misunderstanding. James gave him a kind smile. No harm done. Just remember, appearances can be deceiving. People often assume things about others based on what they see on the surface. He glanced over at the officer, now sitting in his patrol car, looking defeated. And that's where they get it wrong. Grace nodded, her gaze shifting to the officer as well. Some people need a reminder of who's truly in control. With that, James turned to walk toward the clubhouse, his gait slow but sure. The members, now fully aware of the situation, parted like the tide as he passed. There was a quiet respect in their movements, a newfound acknowledgement of the power he held, one that didn't need to be shouted or flaunted. It was simply there, in the way he carried himself, in the way he had handled the situation. As they entered the clubhouse, the door swung open, and for a moment, I could hear the sound of soft laughter echoing from within. It was clear that, despite the tension outside, the situation had ended not in conflict, but in a subtle victory, a reminder of who truly ran the show. James Harrington didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The club, and everything within it, belonged to him, in a way that was more than just ownership. It was about respect, influence, and the quiet power of knowing exactly who you are. The following weeks were surprisingly calm at the club, considering the drama that had unfolded on that fateful Saturday. But there was something different now. The air had shifted. No one dared to forget who James Harrington was, not that they ever would again. His quiet authority had left a lasting impression, not just on the officer, but on the entire club. People spoke of that moment in hushed tones, of how the elderly man had been detained and the way he'd commanded respect without raising his voice. Rumors began to circulate about James' history, how he had built the club from the ground up, how he had connections that reached into places most people only read about in the news, and how he had always been a man who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. I caught a glimpse of him one afternoon as I walked the course. He was sitting on a bench by the lake, watching the ducks glide across the water. His usual calm demeanor was still there, but now it had taken on a certain weight. A man of his stature didn't need to explain himself or assert his position, it was just understood. I stood there for a moment, watching him, and realized something profound. I had witnessed not just an act of power, but of wisdom. The officer. I hadn't seen him since that day. Word had it he had been reassigned to a less prestigious post after the incident. Some people said he'd been embarrassed, others said he was lucky to keep his job at all. Regardless, it was clear he had learned a valuable lesson: assumptions could break you, and sometimes, the most powerful people in the room don't need to prove anything. Grace was still around, of course. She remained a quiet figure of support for James, always present when needed but never demanding attention. I wondered just how much she knew of his life, of the web of connections and favors that had built this quiet empire. I had no doubt that behind every word she spoke, there was knowledge and influence, an understanding of the true dynamics at play. As for the club, it thrived, as it always had. James continued to play his rounds quietly, a fixture of the place that people came to respect not for the wealth or power he represented, but for the unspoken truth, that he was, and always had been, the heartbeat of the community. And that was something no officer or outsider could take away from him. Months passed, and the story of the detainment became one of those whispered legends at the club, retold by members with a mixture of awe and disbelief. But for James Harrington, life returned to a predictable rhythm, quiet, controlled, and resolutely in his hands. Yet there was something else lingering beneath the surface. I noticed it one afternoon when I walked by the clubhouse. Grace was in deep conversation with a few of the club's higher-tier members, and from the way they were leaning in, I could tell they weren't discussing golf. It was clear something had shifted, and as I overheard bits of their conversation, I began to realize that James had started to pull the strings even further than anyone knew. The officer, still fresh in everyone's mind, had quietly disappeared from the scene, but the ripple effect hadn't gone unnoticed. The higher-ups in local law enforcement were now making sure to show James a level of deference previously unheard of. Whispers in the locker room spoke of officers being advised not to make waves at the club, as if the unspoken rules had changed. Even the city council, which had once brushed past the club without much thought, had begun sending representatives to make sure they were on good terms with James. It wasn't just the officers. People were quietly shifting around him, bending to his will without even fully realizing it. At one of the monthly member dinners, I watched as James casually mentioned a change he wanted to see made to the club's bylaws. A few weeks later, the change was made without question. It wasn't that James had become more demanding, no, it was the opposite. He'd always been the calm center, but now it seemed like everything and everyone was slowly moving in his direction. There was no need to shout or raise his voice. He simply spoke, and those who needed to listen did so with reverence. It was a power that wasn't wielded through force, but through quiet influence, a lesson no one would forget. One evening, as I was leaving the club, I saw him again, sitting on the same bench by the lake, watching the sunset. He looked peaceful, content even. I approached him cautiously, unsure if I was intruding on his solitude. "Is it always like this?" I asked, nodding toward the bustling clubhouse, which was now alive with more activity than ever. James turned his head, and for a moment, our eyes met. "Power, influence, it's not about what you can take or demand, son. It's about understanding the balance. Knowing when to step forward and when to let things flow on their own. When you have that, people just follow. Without realizing it." I stood there in silence, absorbing his words. James wasn't just talking about golf or clubs. He was talking about life, how those who truly understand their place in the world don't need to fight for it. It's something that comes naturally, without struggle. "Just don't forget who helped you get here," he added with a knowing smile, as if he had read my mind. I nodded, silently acknowledging the wisdom in his words. As I walked away, I realized that what had happened wasn't just about one officer learning a lesson. It was about a community, a quiet power reshaping everything in its path without ever demanding it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the true legacy of James Harrington. Not the club he owned, not the influence he had, but the way he had shown us all that real power didn't need to make a sound, it just needed to be. The weeks that followed only reinforced the truth that James had known all along. True influence was subtle, like the steady tide shaping the shore. The club continued to thrive, its members more loyal than ever, their interactions now laced with a quiet understanding. There was a change in the air, something unspoken, yet felt by everyone who walked through the doors. James Harrington wasn't just the club owner anymore, he was the embodiment of the club's soul. But not everyone was content with this shift. As the months passed, there were murmurs among a few members who were uncomfortable with how much influence James seemed to wield. They whispered about the way things had changed, how the power dynamics had subtly shifted, and how the club felt less like a shared space and more like a kingdom with James as its ruler. They had been used to the old days, the times when decisions were made by committee, when there was a sense of equality among the members. But now, James' quiet leadership had made them feel as though they were just pawns in a game they didn't understand. One afternoon, as I was finishing my round, I overheard a conversation between two of these members, Tom and Alex, both regulars at the club, who seemed especially uneasy. Their voices were low, but their words were sharp. "It's getting out of hand," Tom said, his voice filled with frustration. "James hasn't just taken over the club. He's taken over everything, every decision, every event. It's like he's pulling strings we can't even see. No one's challenging him." Alex nodded. "It's not even about the club anymore. It's about control. And we're all just going along with it. It's unnerving." I wanted to listen in, but I knew it wasn't my place. So, I continued walking, pretending not to hear. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. I had seen it before, when power becomes too absolute, it creates resentment in those who feel overlooked or sidelined. I didn't know what would happen, but I had a feeling that things were about to get even more complicated. The next day, as I made my way to the club for my usual round, I noticed a few more faces, new members who hadn't been around long, and yet their presence seemed to carry a certain air of authority. One of them, a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit, made his way toward James as he was sitting on the terrace, enjoying his usual afternoon coffee. The man had a confident, even cocky, swagger to him, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was one of the new forces making their way into James's world. James greeted him with a small smile, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating, as he shook the man's hand. I couldn't hear their conversation, but the tone was different from the usual calm exchanges James had with the longtime members. This man didn't seem to be treating James as the founder or the respected elder he was, he seemed to treat him more like an equal. It was subtle, but I could see the shift. Over the next few days, the tension among the old guard became more apparent. Members started pulling James aside for private conversations, their words guarded, their eyes wary. Something was building, but I couldn't tell exactly what. It wasn't until I saw Grace walking briskly across the parking lot, her face unusually tight, that I realized how serious things were becoming. I approached her cautiously. "Is everything okay, Grace?" I asked. She stopped for a moment, glancing at me. "There's more going on than you realize," she said, her voice soft but edged with concern. "James may have won the battle, but there are those who still don't like how things are going. They're starting to push back. There are plans in motion." I didn't need to ask who they were. The old guard, the members who felt like they had lost their place in James's growing empire. "This won't end well," Grace continued, her eyes darkening. "It's only a matter of time before the quiet power James built will face a challenge. And when it does, everything will change." I nodded, sensing the weight of her words. I had always thought James's influence was unshakable, that he had mastered the game in a way no one else could. But now, I realized that the game wasn't over. The pieces were shifting again, and this time, James might not have as much control as he thought. Days turned into weeks, and the air around the club had grown thick with tension. The members who had once been in awe of James's calm authority now began to question his decisions, questioning whether the club's spirit had shifted too far from its original foundation. The whispers were becoming louder, and the sense of unease that had been simmering beneath the surface was now unmistakable. I saw the changes firsthand. The usual friendly, familiar faces that had filled the lounge were now replaced with newer members, people whose eyes glittered with ambition and whose conversations carried the weight of business deals and power moves. The once laid-back atmosphere had slowly shifted towards something more competitive, more transactional. Then, one evening, it all came to a head. I was at the bar when I noticed James and a small group of the old guard sitting in a secluded corner, their conversation low but intense. Grace stood nearby, her arms crossed, watching them with a cold intensity. The group included some of the most influential members, men who had been with the club since its inception. Their voices were quiet but full of dissatisfaction. "James, one of them, Harold, began, his voice thick with frustration, "this club was founded on principles of camaraderie, community, not manipulation. You've changed things, and not for the better. People are starting to notice." James's expression remained unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, he wasn't just listening now. He was sizing up Harold and the others, carefully weighing his response. "Harold," James said slowly, his voice even, "I've done nothing but ensure this club continues to thrive. You're just upset because things aren't as easy as they once were. Growth comes with discomfort. But growth comes with balance," Harold shot back, his face turning red. "When you start stacking the deck, when you make it your club and forget about the members who built it with you, that's where things go wrong." I could feel the temperature in the room drop. The air was charged, like the moments before a storm. The other members glanced at each other nervously, unsure whether they should step in or remain silent. But James wasn't finished. "You're wrong," James said softly, but there was power behind his words. "This club's future wasn't built by nostalgia. It was built by vision. I see potential here. I see a future. If you can't see that, Harold, then maybe you're the one who's lost touch." Harold's face twisted in anger. He slammed his hand on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "You think this is about potential? You're more interested in power than anything else. You've pushed us out, James. You've turned this place into your kingdom, and you're treating us like we're insignificant. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating the conversation. For a moment, no one moved. But then, James stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. It's not about power, Harold. It's about doing what's right for this club. For everyone who's here now, and for those who will be here long after we're gone. His gaze swept over the group. I didn't ask for this responsibility, but I've taken it on. And if that means making hard choices, then so be it. Harold stood as well, his expression filled with defiance, but there was something in his eyes now, uncertainty. The fire in him had dimmed just enough for James to seize control of the moment. The group exchanged uneasy glances, none of them willing to challenge James openly. But the fracture had been made, the first crack in the unspoken trust they had once shared. Grace, who had remained quiet through the entire exchange, stepped forward. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low, almost a warning. "People will challenge James. People always do. But remember, there's more power in the quiet than you might think. And in the end, those who underestimate him, won't see it coming." The word struck like a chord, and for a moment, I could feel the weight of the room's silence. The shift had happened, and things would never be the same again. James had won the battle with Harold, but the war was far from over. There were still those in the club who would resist, who would push against the changes James had made, but they were too late. The foundation had been set. James had proven that his quiet power was not to be underestimated. As I walked out of the club that night, I felt the weight of it all. James had changed the game. Whether he would continue to win was yet to be seen, but there was no going back now. The club had entered a new era, one where power was no longer wielded by the many, but by the few, those who truly understood the quiet strength behind the throne. The weeks that followed seemed to stretch on like the slow turn of seasons. The tension in the club was undeniable, but it had also evolved into something more subtle, something more pervasive. James's influence had settled in like a quiet shadow that no one seemed willing, or able, to confront directly. The members, those who had once questioned his methods, had now begun to realize that resistance was futile. The dynamics of the club had changed, and they had little choice but to accept it. Harold and the others who had opposed him found themselves increasingly isolated. Their words, though loud in the moment, had carried little weight in the long run. It was as if they had unknowingly stepped into a game they weren't equipped to play. The club, once a place where everyone had a voice, had transformed into a stage where James was the only actor, and the rest of them were mere spectators. I had watched it all unfold, feeling like an outsider looking in. At first, I couldn't decide if I admired James or feared him. His calm demeanor, his quiet command, was unlike anything I had seen before. He never had to raise his voice or make grand gestures. All he needed was the unwavering confidence that no one could challenge him. One evening, as I sat in the lounge, I saw James sitting alone at his usual spot by the window, gazing out over the lush expanse of the golf course. He looked the same as always, relaxed, composed, with the weight of the world seemingly resting on his shoulders, yet he carried it with ease. Grace walked past me and glanced in his direction before making her way to his table. I couldn't hear their conversation, but it was clear that they were no longer talking about the club, at least not directly. The few words I caught sounded more like a long-term strategy than a casual chat. In those moments, I realized that James's control over the club had never just been about power, it was about creating something larger than himself, something that transcended the golf course. For all the drama, for all the tension that had plagued the past months, James had done exactly what he set out to do. He had turned the club into an institution, an undeniable presence in the community. The club was now synonymous with him, and no one, no officer, no disgruntled member, could take that away. And so, it ended. Not with an explosive confrontation or a public defeat, but with the quiet, inevitable acceptance of James Harrington's dominance. The old guard, now mostly in the background, had no choice but to recognize that they had lost. There would be no more battles. The club was his, and it was his in a way that no one could ever fully understand. In the end, it wasn't about the golf course, the deals, or even the power. It was about legacy. James hadn't just built a club, he had built a legacy, a quiet, powerful force that would carry on long after he was gone. As I left the club for the last time, I looked back at the sprawling estate, the calm lakeside, and the towering clubhouse. I realized that James had won not just because of his influence, but because he had understood something the rest of us never truly grasped: the greatest power lies not in the battles we fight, but in the battles we never have to face. And in the end, James Harrington had never had to fight at all.